were 600,000 angels waiting to greet Yaakov Avinu on his way into Eretz Yisrael. Good evening. We want to welcome everybody to our Wednesday night Kollel learning. Wednesday night we learn Zera Shimshon, which is a very special Sefer ala Chumash. And this evening is in dedication and sponsored in memory of our beloved Shaul ben Nisim v'Sara Halevi. We love him very much. Always remember him for the good. And Zichrono Livracha, may his aliyah have his neshama have a continued aliyah. Amen. Amen. This week we're reading a very interesting parasha, as all the parashiot are. And last week we read about Yaakov Avinu returning home to his parents after a long 36 years. Yaakov Avinu arrives home and he sees his parents, and he's now the age 99. And it's been a long time, and he spends the next 21 years with his father before his father passes away. Yitzhak passes away at 180 years old. There was a 60-year difference between Isaac and Jacob. He spends the next 21 years of his life in the company and learning with his father, Yitzhak. Very nice. At this moment, when he comes home, Yosef is the age of 8. When Yaakov was 99, Yosef was 8 years old. 8 years old, very nice. 9 years later, Yosef is at the age of 17. At the age of 17, our commentaries explain us, was the first time in his life, obviously besides for the travel back home from his father's house, from his grandfather's house, from Lavan's house to Yitzhak's house, but it was the first time that he left the ohel. He left his tent. His whole life, he was in the yeshiva, in the ohel, and only learning Torah with his father and with his grandfather. Very nice. He comes out and he does two things which are wrong. The two things that he does wrong, the Me'am Loez, to those of us who are familiar with Rabbi Yaakov Kuli, he says that he did two things which are wrong. The first is that he was fixing his hair and he was caring about his appearance too much. He was very into the way he dressed, the way he looked, the way his hair was perfect. He was conscious about that. And what's the issue with that? The issue with that is, unfortunately, when one is too conscious about the way they look, then that invites the Yetzer Hara. As a man, it invites women who shouldn't be in his life. And as a woman, when a woman dresses up too much, and it's not obviously for her husband, unfortunately it invites and attracts men, which should not be in her life. And Yosef was too involved with that. Now, what was Yosef HaTzadik thinking? Yosef was, listen, I'm an individual who learned Torah. It's only proper that I respect myself. It doesn't mean that the more mitzvot a person does, the more Torah a person learns, that he should now degrade himself and dress not properly and not shave and not cut their hair. But at his level, he spent too much emphasis on that. And as we see later, that's unfortunately what brought on the wife of Potiphar, as we read later in this parasha. So that was the first mistake he did. The second mistake he did, and this is famous that we all know of, he spoke negatively about his brothers. He said 3 things which were derogatory, slander, lashon hara, about his brothers. Now, before we get into what that exactly was, the question is, how did he come to do that? So listen to the dynamic of Yaakov Avinu's family. It's very interesting. There were 6 children who were Leah's and Yaakov's children. It was Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Issachar, and Zevulun. These were the 6 children of Leah. Then there were the 4 children of Zilpah and Bilhah, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan, all 4 of them. And then there was Yosef. Binyamin was still a baby. Yosef found himself hanging out with the children of the maidservants. Why? It was obviously closer proximity of age, but the other children, Leah's children, did have a sense of resentment and unfortunate animosity towards their brother Yosef. After all, Yosef was the son of the favorite wife, and he was the spoiled one. He had a fancy, colorful coat, so they didn't like him too much. And Yosef started hanging around with the children of the maidservants, and he saw that the way the other brothers treated them was unjust. He said, it's not fair. Before Zilpah and Bilhah were married to Yaakov, they were freed. They were not slaves anymore. So it's not fair, he said, that you guys consider them as sons of slaves. Their mothers were not slaves anymore. We're all equal brothers. And to this he had that disagreement with the children of Leah, and that is what led him to the first of three things that he told his father, which were still negative, and that was that they were degrading and disrespecting the children of Zilpah and Bilhah. So that was the first. The first was, well, in no specific order, but the first of three was that he was speaking derogatory about his brothers, that they were degrading and disrespecting the maidservants' sons. The second thing he said was, Abba, my brothers are eating ever min hachai. Ever min hachai is as follows. They were eating from a live animal. We're going to analyze that in a second. The third thing he said was, Abba, they are suspected for illicit and inappropriate relationships with women. And we'll explain that as well. So now, when it comes to Ever min hachai, what was the claim? How could, as follows, how could the brothers who were righteous individuals, how could they be unfortunately so mistaken or given to their evil inclination so much that they're going to eat from a live animal which is prohibited? You need to slaughter it first. And that they're going to berate and disrespect their other brothers, as well as chas v'shalom, inappropriate relationships. How could it be? And then on the other hand, why would Yosef say so if it wasn't true? So either way, the whole story does not make too much sense. And to this, the Me'am Loez, as we're giving an introduction to the parasha, he explains to us what the sides of each one was. When it came to Ever min hachai, when it came to eating from a live animal, there was one of two ways to understand. I'll do the more difficult one first. The more difficult one is, what's the reason why we need to slaughter an animal before we eat it? And the reason is, in order that we do not act cruelly and cold-blooded towards an animal and eat it while it is still alive and suffering. First we slaughter it, we kill it, and then we're able to partake in it. Now, this is what the sons were doing according to this opinion. What they would do is they would slaughter the animal, and as many of us have seen, and here in Florida we see something similar all the time, when we see a lizard. Sometimes the lizard loses its tail, loses an arm, a leg, a head, and the rest of the body is still moving. Is the lizard alive? No, the lizard is not alive. When you cut the snake's head off, the snake is dead. Okay? The part, let's say the tail that comes off, the tail's dead, right? But there's life to it. It seems like there's life to it. It's still moving around. What's it doing? It's twitching. That part of the body, so if it's the head, yeah, the whole body is dead, but it's still moving. And if it's another part of the body, well, whatever part of the body is cut off and put aside, well, that's only twitching, but that part of the body is now dead. When an animal, has any of us ever seen a chicken being slaughtered? When a chicken is slaughtered, it's not slit its throat, it's done. No, that thing is moving, it's wild like anything. It's the nerves that it has that it's still letting out. And therefore, what they used to do was they would slaughter the animal, and they would say, even before the animal's completely dead, they went over and they cut off a limb and then they would eat from it. Why would they do so? They had a tradition back in the day that if you eat from an animal as close as possible to its death, it's more nutritious and it gives more strength to the one who consumes it. So they wanted to be strong, they wanted to eat healthy. So what they did was they slaughtered the animal and then they ate from it right away, even though it was halachically dead, but there was still a twitch to it and it was still jumping back and forth. It had its nerves coming out. So Yosef came and said, you can't do that. Even though according to the Torah you're allowed to do that, he claimed we're still not Bnei Israel until we receive the Torah. We know that we say that our forefathers, they fulfilled the Torah before the Torah was given. This famous, Avraham Avinu kept Pesach. What does that mean, Avraham Avinu kept Pesach? This was years and years and years before they even went to Egypt and get out of Egypt. What are we talking about? So what Yosef, look how good Yosef came and said. Yosef came and said, yes, you can fulfill the Torah as a stringency, but not as a leniency. Meaning, the reason why Goyim, one of the 7 Noahide laws, is that a Gentile is not allowed to eat from a live animal. The animal has to be dead. Now, for a Gentile, you could shoot it, you could stone it, you can chop its head off. It doesn't need to be slaughtered, that's fine. But it has to be dead. For Jews, that's not the point. The point is not killing it. The point is not the cruelty aspect. The point is God said to slaughter it. And therefore, according to Jews, once the animal is slaughtered, you're allowed to eat from the animal, even to take a piece off while it's twitching back and forth. But for a Bnei Noach, for Gentiles, not. And this is one of the interesting things that Gentiles are supposed to be more stringent than Jews on. So he said, you can use and say that you need to fulfill the Torah only as a stringency, but not when it turns out to be a leniency. And that was their vikuach, that was their machloket, their disagreement between the two. That's one example. It's very interesting. The most famous example that we've all heard of was the concept of ben pakua. Ben pakua is as follows. The Torah says, if an animal is slaughtered, a mother slaughtered a cow, and inside the mother there's a baby calf, a fetus. According to the Torah, that cow, that little calf, since the mother was slaughtered, its life source has been slaughtered, and it's still a part of the body. The Talmud refers to it as another limb. The same way like when you slaughter a cow, now you can eat its arm or its leg. Well, the fetus is just another limb of the animal, and it could be eaten without slaughtering. It's very interesting. So the brothers, that's what they were doing. They were eating a ben pakua, obviously for maybe nutritious reasons. But Yosef didn't know that. He judged them negatively, and then he went and told his father. That was the difference of opinion when it came to eating from a live animal. Then, what happened with suspecting them to do inappropriate things with women? Well, the brothers, they were businessmen. They were shepherds. They had to go into marketplaces, they had to buy, they had to sell. So he, as a 17-year-old boy, coming out of the tent, coming out of his yeshiva for the first time, he saw that, he said, how could you be dealing with women in business and not given to your evil inclination and sin? He didn't know, he was naive. And obviously nothing happened with them. And therefore, he was punished for all 3 of them. So they had a difference of opinion. As we all know, brothers, it could be, and it's common to have difference of opinions. And it's very interesting as an outsider, as we are all outsiders to Yosef and the 12 tribes, and the other 10, to see what their difference of opinion was. Now that we saw that, we can now learn what the Midrash and Rashi tells us, that Yosef was paid back for all 3 of those derogatory remarks he made about his brothers to his father. And each one, the Midrash says, was measure for measure. Midah keneged midah. The fact that Yosef came and told his father, hey, they're eating from a live animal. You know what his punishment was? When they came to sell Yosef, they slaughtered a goat. Okay? So we're going to explain that in a moment. They slaughtered a goat. We know that they dipped his blood in it. That's his punishment for it. Now, when it came to him saying that they were berating and disregarding and insulting the children of the maidservants, he was sold like a slave. You're saying that they're disrespecting them for being sons of slaves? That was not true? Okay, you'll be sold as a slave. And then you came and you said that they're suspected to be doing inappropriate things with women? Okay, we're going to give you the test of the wife of Potiphar. So each one was with a correlation. To that, the Zera Shimshon, Zechuto Yagen Alenu, Amen. He says something very interesting. Let's analyze the sin that he made, the bad thing that he said about them, and the punishment. Well, that second one of claiming that the children of the maidservants were being disrespected, that makes sense. So you said that they were being disrespected as being servants, and they really were not. You'll be a slave. That makes sense. But the other two, the Zera Shimshon has a hard time finding what's the correlation between the fact that you said that they don't slaughter the animals before they eat, so they slaughtered an animal before selling you. What does that have to do with anything? How is that, the Zera Shimshon's question is, how is that a punishment? Being sold as a slave, that's already for the second reason. But the first reason of slaughtering an animal before being sold, what's the punishment with that? And then secondly, what's the correlation? So you said that they're suspected for doing inappropriate things with women. So what does the test of Potiphar's wife have to do with the punishment of you who suspected them? Those two, he has a hard time finding it as obvious as the one of the servants. So listen to this very interesting answer the Zera Shimshon gives. He says, and he brings this from the Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch says the reason for not eating, as we said previously, for not eating an animal before it's slaughtered, meaning a live animal, is because it's bloodthirsty, it's heartless, it's against the Jewish belief system. Jews are acronym Gever. We do Gimel for Gimilut Hasadim, Bet for Baishanim, we're bashful, we're shameful, and Resh for Rachmanim, merciful. It's not merciful to eat an animal while it's still alive and suffering. So the Sefer HaChinuch says that's the reason. Now, what does the Zera Shimshon say? Listen how beautiful this is. He says that the Yosef, he came and said to his father that they were eating and doing things that are not proper. Yosef knew that he was disliked by his brothers. He was scared that his father Yaakov was going to start disliking him as well. Why? Because they were the majority. In general, we know we always go with the majority. We believe in democracy, and when it comes to even deciding halachic verdicts, we always go ahare rabim lehatot, based on the majority. That's like what a bet din is. A bet din is always an odd number because there's kind of like a voting system. And therefore, Yosef was scared, maybe my father's going to join that majority and dislike me as well, the same way that my brothers dislike me. Why? Because he was the individual. So what did Yosef come and tell his father? No, Abba, you know why they don't like me? It's not because I sinned, it's not because I've wronged them. The reason why they don't like me is because they're eating from an Ever Min HaChai, and that's making them cold-hearted. That's bringing them to be heartless and bloodthirsty. And that's what's causing them to have the resentment and animosity towards me. He's coming and saying, Abba, it's not me that has sinned. I didn't do anything wrong. It was them. The fact that they're eating from an animal in a way that's promoting. When we understand that when we do things, it leaves an impact on us. Every time we do something good, we become better people, not only because of what we did, rather because what it turned us to become. When we do acts of kindness, when we give charity, when we fulfill mitzvot, when we learn Torah, of course we're doing good. We could even be creating good. But besides for the good that we do, it does good unto us. It makes us better individuals. In this scenario, when a person did something wrong, it also unfortunately makes a person a less better of an individual. They are forgoing on basic tenets that the Torah says, what is the best type of individual, and especially a Jew. So he said, you know why they hate me? They hate me because they're doing something incorrect, and that's clouding their judgment on me. So what did the brothers do? When the brothers came together, as we know, and they judged Yosef, they said, Yosef spoke Lashon Hara about us. He spoke slander, derogatory statements, nevertheless, on us. They came together and they said, he's chayav mita, we need to execute him. He is a rasha, he's an evil individual, let's execute him. So what did they do? They said, you know what? Instead of us killing our own brother, let's do the opposite. Let's do, as we say in Hebrew, hafuch al hafuch. We'll go in the opposite direction with him. We're gonna, instead of killing him, slaughter a goat to prove to him, number one, we are merciful. Number two, we don't eat animals before we slaughter them. We slaughter them before we eat them, and we are not cold-hearted or cold-blooded, and that's why we dislike you. We dislike you because you've wronged us. And they came and they proved, and they said, we're going to slaughter this animal now and prove you wrong. And why a goat? The Zera Shimshon says, because goat's blood is most similar to human beings' blood. And they dipped the coat in the blood to show it to their father and say, a wild animal ate Yosef. Zera Shimshon says that was his punishment. His punishment was that he was proved wrong. His brothers proved him wrong by slaughtering the animal and saying, we're merciful, that's number one. Number two, the same way like we're slaughtering this animal, we always slaughter our animals before we eat them. And the punishment to Yosef was that he was publicly proved wrong for accusing them for eating Ever Min Achai.
What's Zera Shimshon?
The Siftei Chachamim, I'll give an alternative answer. One of the main Mefarshim on Rashi, he asked the same question, he gives an alternative answer. I like it as well. He says, you know what Yosef's punishment was? The midah keneged midah for the slaughtering of the goat? Is that when Yaakov would see his colorful cloak, Yosef's colorful cloak dipped in blood, Yaakov would miyaesh, he would give up on ever finding him again, and he wouldn't pray to find Yosef. If we look at the continuation of the Parashat, for the 22 years that they were separated from one another, we never see that Yaakov prayed to Hashem to find Yosef. Because he was sure that he died. All the more so, the Mefarshim tell us, no one ever told him that he was dead. They never lied, the brothers. They brought him the cloak, it was with blood, and he drew his own conclusion that Yosef was, look at the words, he drew the conclusion that a wild animal came to eat him. And therefore the Siftei Chachamim says, the fact that they slaughtered the animal and they put the blood in his cloak in the blood, Yosef's punishment was that Yaakov would never pray to be reunited with Yosef in this world, because he completely gave up on him. And the fact that Yosef knew that was his punishment. Now let's go on to the concept of doubting or suspecting his brothers for inappropriate relationships. What's the correlation? So fine, he suspected them and then he gets tested with the wife of Potiphar. The Zera Shimshon proves 4 ways how that was a direct punishment for Yosef. The first is, he says, that Yosef was completely embarrassed when the wife of Potiphar, she scram and she made a whole to-do to tell everybody, look what this slave is trying to do. This slave is trying to rape me. This slave is trying to be with me. And that was so embarrassing for Yosef, who everyone knew he was Jewish, everyone knew he was wise, everyone knew he came from a noble family and he was sold as a slave. To him, that was very embarrassing. That's a correlation. He says further, the Talmud tells us that even though Yosef did not commit a full-out sin with the wife of Potiphar, however, the Talmud says, and I'm sorry to put it this way, the Talmud says it, that both of them were in bed together. They didn't touch, but they were in bed together, and Yosef, again, imagine after being tormented for years, day in, day out. by a gorgeous woman who is your boss and who's tempting and trying to do anything and everything to be with you, day in, day out, all day long. And she finally had this plan and everybody was away. It was their holiday and no one was home. She stayed home. She faked sick. So there was a lot of Yetzer Hara going on for Yosef. So Yosef, the Talmud says, entered, not only was in the room with her, they were in the same bed. And he got up in a haste and he said, I cannot. He remembered the image of his father and he said, based on everything my Abba taught me, I cannot do this. And he overcame his Yetzer Hara before the last possible moment. Now, so that was the second. The first is there was some aspects of sin. The second was, it was embarrassing to him. The third is, he sat in jail on account of that for years because he had that whole scoundrel, that whole story with the wife of Potiphar. That's not a punishment, that's an obvious punishment. And the fourth, and this might be a little surprising to many of us, is Yosef was supposed to have 12 tribes just like Yaakov did. But how many children did Yosef have? 2. Ephraim and Menashe. Where's the other 10? Chachamim tell us that Yosef was aroused and enticed by the wife of Potiphar. Thank God, he overcame, Yosef HaTzadik, he overcame his greatest test and he was not intimately with her. However, since he was aroused, and unfortunately, semen was supposed to come out of his brit, Hashem made a miracle and said, I want to keep him pure. And what he did was, 1 drop of semen came out of each of his 10 fingers, and he dug his fingers into the sand so that they go right back to the earth. This is something deep. This is something that maybe some of us have not heard. So that was the 10 children that he should have had on top of Ephraim and Menashe. So his punishment, according to that, was he was 10 children short. He should have had 12, he only had 2. And therefore the Zera Shimshon proves that it was midah keneged midah by each of the punishments. All 3 things that he spoke bad about, he was punished exactly for that. And the lesson is quite obvious. We all know how detrimental Lashon Hara, speaking derogatory and negative about others, are. It's very serious. It ruins relationships, families, friends. God forbid, it's a very, very horrible thing. The Rambam, the Maimonides, says that when one speaks Lashon Hara, 3 people get hurt. The speaker, the listener, and the subject who we're talking about. It's a lose-lose situation for everybody. And so what we can learn from Yosef is, you know what led Yosef to all of his troubles? Was the fact that he talked too much, and unfortunately, he came and he reported negatively about his brothers to his father. The second lesson we can derive from this, is that when one is punished, as sometimes it's hard for us to understand, they deserve that punishment. Now, it's not like we're supposed to look at other people and say, oh, look, he lost this, he tripped there, he fell in that, he got hurt over there. We're not supposed to look and say, they deserved it. No. Look at yourself. Look at ourselves. When certain things happen to us and we look up in God and we say, it's unjust, it shouldn't be, we don't know the calculations that God has. We have to truly believe that any and everything that happens to us happens because we deserve it. Whether we deserve it from now, whether we deserve it from things we did, it's very important. And on the positive note, anything and everything good that happens also is deserved. Midah keneged midah works unfortunately negatively, but most importantly as well positively. And this leads me to take a moment and speak about the psychologic rule of the law of attraction. The law of attraction actually is a Jewish concept. In short, the law of attraction means if you think good, if you wish good onto others, well, good will come your way. And unfortunately, if an individual is pessimistic and negative and wishes bad and evil onto others, well, that's what they're welcoming into their lives. This is a Jewish concept. It's a very simple concept of measure for measure. If you want something to turn out good, you'll find a reason to make it happen and make it turn out for the good. If you're looking for something negative, you'll find in the most beautiful of places, in the most pure of places, the most good of places, you'll find something wrong and something negative. We as human beings have the power to focus in on anything we want. And that's the law of attraction, the way we understand it. If you surround yourself with happy people, if you wish good and success and health onto other people, well, that's what will come your way. But if you're sitting there, not us, if someone is sitting there with ayin hara and looking, how come does this person have that? And look how many children he has, and look how much jewelry she has, and look at that car, and look at that house, and look at this, look at that. You're giving ayin hara on everybody. You're welcoming it onto yourself. The law of attraction is a very, very strong and Jewish concept, and it gives us hope. It gives us hope to know that when we think and wish good unto others, good will come our way. Let's now just turn to another concept, and this is the second Dvar Torah the Zera Shimshon speaks about this week. And we'll give a small intro, that when Avraham Avinu was 70 years old, there was, as we call it, the Brit Ben HaBetarim. This was the covenant, as it said, the covenant between the loaves, as it's eloquently translated, between God and Abraham. And at 70 years old, 30 years before Isaac was born, they met, and God promises Abraham that this land, the land of Israel, will forevermore be yours and your descendants. Abraham questioned. He says, Bama eda ki rashena. How am I going to know? How are you going to know? I'll prove it to you. But before I prove it to you, your descendants will be 400 years in exile. It was a very, very severe punishment. And the 400 years actually started from the birth of Isaac. If you count from the birth of Isaac, 400 years, that's when Pesach was. That's when the Exodus actually was. God was merciful, compassionate on the Jewish people to say, even though I gave your grandpa Avraham 400 years, I'll knock it down to only 210 in the land of Egypt, and only the last 80 years, basically 86 years, will be very bitter. Miriam, right, when she was born. But besides for that, Hashem was very merciful, compassionate on the Jewish people. Now, what does that lead us to? It leads us to the fact that Yosef, when he was 17, he now was the first of our people to go out into exile. Now, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Let me quote to you one line of the Midrash. The Midrash says as follows. Rabbi Achva bar Zera Amar, Averatan shel shevatim zechura hu leolam. The sin of the tribes is remembered forever. The sin of the tribes of faking their brother was dead and selling him as a slave, that sin will always be remembered. And then it continues, tikva hi leolam, and it's salvation forevermore. The Midrash seems to contradict itself. At first it seems like it's something horrible. At second it seems like it's something good for us. So is it good or bad? So the Zera Shimshon brings an opinion of the Siftei Kohen. He says as follows, really, as bad as it was that Yosef went out to be exiled, there was a good aspect to it. The good aspect was that when Yosef left Israel to Egypt, the Shechina, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, also was exiled and went with him to Egypt. And why is that a good thing? Well, it's a good thing because in the future, when the Jewish people will be exiled, the Shechina will not be uncomfortable with the situation of being exiled because it was already exiled. God was already exiled with Yosef HaTzadik. And he says the numerical value of Shechina, which is 385, is the same numerical value as Mitzrayma, which is also 385. The Shechina's first exile was to Egypt. Okay, very nice. How does that answer the question, which is this Midrash saying that the sale was good or bad? So really, it was bad. It's what brought along the exile. The exile they didn't need to be in Egypt for 210 years. They could have been there for less. They could have been there for a day, for a year, much less. But the fact that they sold their brother, that brought on the exile quicker. So in that aspect, it was bad. But there was also a good and a salvation, a hope, an aspect of hope. What was that? That was that in the future, when the Jewish people will, lo alenu, wrong God, and God will come and say they need to be destroyed, He's going to take out His wrath on the temples, on the Bet HaMikdash, the first one and the second one, and destroy them rather than destroying the Jews. And who's that thanks to? To Yosef. Yosef HaTzadik. It's thanks to him that we have God in the exile, in Chutz La'aretz, outside of Israel. It's thanks to Yosef that we have the Shekhinah with us outside of Israel. So it was a good thing and it was a bad thing. The good thing was anytime the Jewish people would go so far away from Hashem, He would exile us and come with us into exile out of Israel, opposed to destroying us and finishing us off. Now that was a good thing. That's a salvation. That's a hope. I'll end off with the Meshech Chochmah. The Meshech Chochmah, one of the foremost commentaries on the Torah, he says that the exile is like a dark night. Dark night is very scary. Nevertheless, as dark and as night as the exile is, God, the Shekhinah, is and will always be with us, even in our hard and dark time. On one condition, he says the Shekhinah will be with us if we follow in the footsteps of our forefathers. If we follow in the footsteps of Yosef, who was exiled, of Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov. If we follow in their footsteps, God will be there with us in our exile. But he says the opposite, unfortunately. If we don't follow the will of God, if we don't include Him in our lives, then unfortunately it's a very scary thing. He says our exile will be dark, gloomy, scary, because the Shekhinah will leave us if we don't welcome Him with us to the exile, to Galut. It's a very scary concept. There's a story of a bunch of kids who were playing around, and there was one kid who was sitting on the floor bawling, crying. And one famous rabbi came over to the child and asked him, "Why are you crying? Why are you not playing with the rest of the other children?" So listen to what the child said. The child said, "Because we were playing hide and go seek, and I was hiding, and no one came to find me." And he was crying because of that. The rabbi looked at the child. He looked up at Shamayim, and he said, "Through the tears and crying of this child, I hear the wailing and the crying of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has been hiding for over 2,000 years, since the destruction of the temple. And he's crying because no one's coming to seek Him. Very few are coming to look for Him." And I think this is a very strong message coming to Chanukah. We are less than a week away from Chanukah. And the message, I think, is just so obvious. Chanukah was a time of darkness for the Jewish people. It was a time of exile, a time of uncertainty. And what did the miracle of Chanukah do with the will and the might and the fight of the Maccabees? They illuminated the darkness. They illuminated the menorah. They brought light to the darkness through fighting for what they truly believed in. And to all of us, that's a very strong lesson. To all of us, that means in our lives, and especially during next week, the week of Chanukah, that if we do feel sometimes alone, or sometimes like it's getting very dark in the exile, we have the power to illuminate it. And how so? By bringing God into our life, by exposing the Shekhinah, exposing the godliness that there is in this world, by doing good to others, by fulfilling the will of God, by learning His divine wisdom, by embracing and bringing others to join us in that pursuit. That's what it means to illuminate the darkness of our exile. That's one of the strongest lessons we learn from Chanukah. So as a quick recap, we learned from the first lesson, the Zera Shimshon, how detrimental and unfortunately powerful Lashon Hara is. As Shlomo HaMelech says in Mishleh, HaChaim ve'amavet biyad HaLashon. Life and death is in the power of our tongue. The tongue has the power to lift and give life. Chas v'shalom, the tongue has the power to bring down and to even kill. And then we learned the importance and the truth of midah keneged midah, measure for measure. Everyone gets what they deserve. Whether we understand it or not, God has a master plan. And then we finished off with that last concept. That concept of, no matter how dark the exile is, we're able to illuminate it through our deeds and through the good things that we do. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu bless all of us in the merit of Rabbi Shimshon Haim Nachmani, which is the Zera Shimshon. The Zera Shimshon promised that anyone who learns his Sefer, anyone who learns his Chidushei Torah, they will be blessed. He promises it. There are very few authors of books who promise peace, happiness, health, salvation, prosperity. Children following in the ways of Torah and mitzvot. And therefore this year we dedicated Wednesday nights to learning the holy and powerful words of the Zera Shimshon. May his merit give all of us merit, all of our children who need help finding shidduchim, any women and couples who need to have children, anyone who's struggling with health, anyone who's struggling in any business or livelihood issues, anyone who needs to find that simchat hachaim, needs to be lifted up and find joy and happiness in their life. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu give it to all of us, and may in the merit of Shaul ben Sarah HaLevi, we also all be blessed and never forget what he stood for and what he taught to those of us who knew him for long, for those of us who knew him for a short amount of time. He was the type of individual that empowered you, one of the most respectful individuals. He lived by not speaking Lashon Hara. As his family has always told me, he never said a bad thing about anybody. As he understood what midah keneged midah was, he understood that whatever happens for the good and for the bad, for the sweet, for the ugly, it was all for the good. And he was, in my humble opinion, an individual who brought light to our dark exile. Through his prayers, through his tehillim, through his honor and through his respect to those who were older, of equal, and even of much younger age. And if I can send him a message, and I know he hears it, that we miss you very much, and we love you very much, and we appreciate the time on this world that we had with you, and that we'll continue following in those ethics and those morals that he lived by and would want all of us to live by as well. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.